Section 28, Ethical Compensation Conversations and Buyer Representation. Sarah had just finished meeting with a young couple who wanted to purchase their first home in Gilbert. As she gathered her notes, one of the buyers asked a question she had been hearing more frequently than ever before. "So, how do you get paid?" Sarah smiled. "I'm glad you asked." She placed the buyer-broker employment agreement on the table. "Before we begin looking at homes, it's important that you understand exactly how representation works, the services I'll provide, and how my brokerage may be compensated." The buyers nodded. "We appreciate you explaining it." Later that afternoon, Sarah stopped by David's office. "It seems like every buyer is asking questions about compensation now." David smiled. "They should be. Transparency builds trust." He explained that today's Arizona real estate market places a greater emphasis on clear communication and written agreements before buyers begin touring property. "The conversation isn't really about compensation," David explained. "It's about helping consumers understand their choices." He reminded Sarah that the buyer-broker employment agreement establishes the relationship between the buyer and the brokerage. It explains the services the brokerage will provide, how compensation may be earned, and the responsibilities of both the buyer and the broker. "Most importantly," David said, "buyers deserve to understand exactly what they're signing." Imagine you're meeting with first-time home buyers in Chandler. Before scheduling the first showing, one of them asks, "What happens if the seller isn't offering compensation to your brokerage?" How would you respond? Experienced Arizona realtors understand that this is an educational conversation, not a sales conversation. The buyer should understand that broker compensation is negotiable and that several options may exist depending on the transaction. Your responsibility is to explain those options clearly, answer questions honestly, and allow the buyer to make informed decisions. David reminded Sarah that the Realtor Code of Ethics begins with Article 1, which requires realtors to protect and promote their clients' interests while treating all parties honestly. That principle applies to compensation conversations too, David explained. You should never pressure a buyer into signing an agreement they don't understand. You should never avoid discussing compensation because the conversation feels uncomfortable. Your job is to educate. Sarah asked another question. "What if a buyer asks whether we should avoid looking at homes where the seller isn't offering compensation?" David immediately shook his head. That's where ethics become very important. He explained that realtors should never steer buyers toward or away from properties based on the compensation being offered to the brokerage. Instead, realtors should help buyers find properties that meet their needs and discuss any compensation considerations openly and honestly as part of the transaction. "Consumers should always know they're making informed decisions," David said. He continued by explaining that clear documentation is just as important as clear communication. The buyer-broker employment agreement should accurately reflect the agreement between the buyer and the brokerage. If the agreement changes during the relationship, those changes should be documented appropriately. Experienced Arizona brokers encourage their agents to review the agreement with buyers, answer questions before signatures are obtained, and avoid rushing through the conversation. David shared a story from one of his agents. A buyer later claimed they didn't understand how representation worked or when compensation could become their responsibility. Fortunately, the agent had carefully reviewed the agreement, answered every question, and documented the discussion in the transaction file. The buyer later admitted they simply forgot the conversation. The documentation protected everyone, David explained. Professional realtors understand that transparency creates confidence. When buyers understand the services they're receiving, how representation works, and how compensation may be handled, they are better equipped to make informed decisions throughout the transaction. Consumers appreciate honesty. They appreciate education. And they appreciate realtors who take the time to explain the process instead of simply asking for a signature. Those conversations not only protect the consumer, they also strengthen the professionalism of the real estate industry and build lasting client relationships based on trust. Online Discussion 1. Why is it important to discuss the buyer-broker employment agreement before showing property? Answer. Discussing the agreement before showing property helps buyers understand the services the brokerage will provide, how representation works, and how compensation may be handled. Clear communication establishes expectations, reduces misunderstandings, and allows buyers to make informed decisions before beginning the home search. 2. Imagine a buyer asks how your brokerage is compensated. How should you respond? Answer. I would explain the compensation provisions contained in the buyer-broker employment agreement, discuss the available options, answer the buyer's questions honestly, and emphasize that compensation is negotiable. My goal would be to educate the buyer so they understand the agreement before signing it. 3. Why should realtors avoid steering buyers based on compensation? Answer. Realtors have an ethical obligation to place their clients' interests first. Buyers should be shown properties that best meet their needs and objectives, not properties selected because of the compensation offered to the brokerage. Honest communication and transparency help protect consumers and maintain public confidence in the profession.